Welcome to Energy Stew. This is Peter Roth, your host. And I'd like to ask you, have you had transformative spiritual experiences? And if so, what does that say about you? And how do you relate to it in a scientific world that we're in? Well, we're going to talk to a man who has really devoted his life to both science and spirituality, and has written a new book called Science and Spiritual Practices, Transformative Experiences and Their Effects on Our Bodies, Brains, and Health. I'm so excited to be interviewing Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert, welcome to Energy Stew.
Glad to be with you, Peter.
This is very important work that you're doing, and what always impresses me is when scientists try to tackle spirituality in their work and help people understand that nature from a scientist's viewpoint. And you certainly hold both very dearly. So, your other books, you have a recent book that had to do with scientific practice and how that is limited because so many scientists really don't understand spirituality and also are dogmatists in their own right. And I think one of your biggest, perhaps, issues in life is that you're very far from a dogmatist.
Yes, gets me into trouble.
Right. You've gotten into a lot of trouble because you're breaking the mold and you're asking questions and you're asking people to ask questions that they don't normally ask. And then they don't like it. So can you tell us, what drives you? What's really the biggest driving force in your life?
I think the biggest driving force is trying to open things up, from the restrictions and dogmas of science. And also in the spiritual realm, the trying to sort of open up the spirit of inquiry. I think spirituality is about inquiry, but people often see it as being about dogma. In my experience, religious people in Britain, at any rate, generally speaking, much less dogmatic than defenders of scientific materialism. But I think in both areas, there's a need for moving on. My book, Science Set Free, is about moving on from the dogmas of science. And Science and Spiritual Practices is about looking at spiritual practices afresh, which science can help us do. And recognizing we're in this unique situation today where we have access to spiritual practices from almost all the world's spiritual traditions. They're open to us now as never before. And so it's really trying to make sense of what's happening here. And science can illuminate this because, for example, all traditions have some form of meditation. And they all have something in common. Traditionally, they didn't recognize that other people were doing something rather similar. And the scientific approach can help us to show, to see what's in common between them and understand better what's going on.
Right, because nowadays science can measure brain waves and energy activity around the body.
And not just brain waves and energy activity, but also the effects of the meditation or other spiritual practices. What effect do they have on people's life and health over longer term periods?
Right. And so we juxtapose that with the history of religion and how that has either supported that, and there are underpinnings of all religions that are very spiritual and have very strong practices that people have really advanced consciousness in.
Absolutely, yes. I think all religions start from spiritual experiences. For example, the Buddha didn't get to where he was by studying for a PhD and working as a postdoc in theology. He got there by meditating, becoming an ascetic, meditating. And he was enlightened sitting under a tree, not through working in a library or a seminar room. And likewise, Jesus didn't get to where he was through just studying, nor did the ancient rishis of the Himalayas. They were meditating in caves and exploring the nature of the mind. The same with the Buddha and Buddhist monks. And so I think that the basis of all religions is really a kind of mystical sense of connection or union, an expanded state of consciousness, which can be arrived at through spiritual practices. And sometimes these experiences come spontaneously, so it's not always a result of practice, but practices can help.
Right. And then the religions are pursued by people who haven't had these experiences and create dogma around them.
Well, sometimes I think that they're developed by. Sometimes they have had these experiences, but when you're trying to teach about this to people who haven't, and after all, most children haven't, and most people getting on with their lives haven't, then you have to say something about what's going on, and you have to talk about it even though people haven't had the experience. I mean, this is true of any area of education. I mean, most scientists, most people who study science at school or at university have not actually explored the Higgs boson in the Large Hadron Collider. They haven't actually discovered the structure of DNA for themselves. They haven't actually spent years in field work in the Amazon or any of those things. They're learning it all from books. And later, when they do a PhD or a postdoc, they actually get research experience. But if you compare it with science, which is based on experience, or at least experiment, which is a form of experience, again, there too, you have to teach it without supposing people have already had these experiences. I think it's inevitable.
Right, and there are different kinds of people. So there are so many people who are very smart scientists, but for some reason, they're not open-minded about extraneous ideas that might make their science even wiser.
Yes, I mean, I think some people prefer to get on with the details, and there's nothing wrong with that. As you say, there are different kinds of people, different dispositions. I think where it goes wrong is when people think that science has all the answers and all the truth. That's really what one could call scientism, making science into a religion. Not all scientists do that. And in fact, a lot of people who are devotees of scientism aren't even scientists. They're true believers in this cult of science, but don't know very much about it.
Right, and perhaps can't know very much about it because their minds are driven towards dogmatism.
Yes, I think that, there are different dispositions, and we're not going to make everyone the same, nor should we try. But I do think that a great many people are open to spiritual experience, and I think that's why, even though this is one of the most secular ages in the history of the world, especially in Europe, millions of people now have spiritual practices. I mean, yoga and meditation, for example, in the last 50 years have traveled far beyond their native home in India and have become worldwide phenomena. About 18 million Americans now meditate, for example. And that shows a lot of people actually want to take up spiritual practices.
Right. And I've been looking a lot at evolution and where our world is headed. And we're reaching a point where we need these spiritual practices to find deeper truths in order to solve seemingly unsolvable problems in the world. And so it makes sense on a very serendipitous level and synchronistic level that the East would come West at this point in time so that we could actually rise above Western limitations.
Yes, Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important that that happens. Um, but there are also spiritual practices which have always been common in all traditions, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, everything.
Right.
One of them is singing and chanting. Every religion has singing and chanting as part of it. Chanting being a kind of rather simplified form of singing with simpler tunes and words, more repetitive words. But we find this absolutely everywhere, you know, in tribal cultures in Africa, in Christian churches, you know, in Sufi Qawwali and devotional singing. We find this everywhere, and the reason is that it's very fundamental to our nature, and singing and chanting bring us together with other people in a kind of physiological synchrony. That, again, an insight from recent scientific research. So, you know, there's one of the points I make in my book where I discuss 7 different spiritual practices is precisely that there are a whole range of spiritual practices. Meditation is one, singing and chanting is another. And they do different things. Meditation is usually done alone in a quiet place, and you can do it with other people, but you're not interacting while you're doing it. Whereas singing and chanting is more to do with group spirituality, where you're brought together as a group through singing together.
Well, what I found fascinating in your book is that you really traveled the world. When you were younger, you spent many years in different esoteric environments around the world. And then finally, you actually chose to embrace yourself in your roots of a Christian religion. And that says a lot about what Western religion can offer that a lot of people don't understand. And you actually can represent these 7 different spiritual experiences that people can have that you can find in your religion as well as others.
Yes, I mean, I went through a long atheist phase, and then I got interested in Hindu type meditation. I had a Sufi practice for a year when I was living in India. I've sort of taken part in shamanic practices. But in the end, I found that reconnecting with my own tradition was a very healing process, because it brings me more into harmony with my ancestors, my own tradition, the sacred places of England. And it works for me. I'm not claiming that Christianity or the Anglican branch of it, my own branch, is the one true path to God. I don't think that at all. But I think for someone like me who's been brought up in that tradition, it's the most natural way. And what I've found through learning from other traditions is that the spiritual practices that I've learned through, for example, Hindu forms of meditation or Buddhist forms of meditation can be done within a Christian context too. So it's a matter of rediscovering the spirituality that's inherent in my own tradition. And I think everyone can do that wherever they're coming from, if they're Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, whatever tradition they're grounded in, it's possible to develop within that tradition, and these practices can all play a part in it.
That's wonderful, and I think that it really helps people. And you talk a lot in your book about atheism and how atheists can be very spiritual, and yet, you know, there's a really, I've always wondered and agreed actually that atheists have a point about that there's, you know, in a sense, there's no proof of, let's say, a God, and religions point to a God, some religions, and they're saying, no, I can't understand that. And yet some of them lead very spiritual lives. And so what I believe about it is that, yeah, I understand that the definition of God is more what people don't like rather than a sense of oneness, a sense of a creative force.
Yes, and no, I agree. I think atheists are saying we don't believe in the kind of God we think that people who believe in God believe in. And I don't believe in the kind of God that atheists don't believe in either. The kind of God they don't believe in is usually a God external to nature, who has particularly vindictive, judgmental value systems. I don't believe in that kind of God either. And actually, I don't think that's the way that most believers in God have actually seen God or experienced God. So I think part of atheism is a reaction against misunderstandings about the nature of God, sometimes misunderstandings by religious people themselves. And in some cases, it's kind of angry. It's the people who feel they've been damaged by religion. I mean, people who've been brought up in repressive religious families. Some people, like the late psychologist Oliver Sacks, became atheist as a teenager because he was Jewish and gay, and his Jewish relatives told him God severely disapproved of him being gay, so he severely disapproved of God and became an atheist. But he had a real enduring sense of the mystery of life and the nature of the mind. And it's interesting that he still remained very linked to the Jewish tradition. His nephew, Jonathan Sacks, was the chief rabbi of Britain. There's often a kind of ambiguity in people's atheism, and often based on some kind of, at least the militant ones, seem to have some kind of personal anger. But I think that the way forward for everyone really is through rediscovering what they're relating to through direct experience. And Philip Pullman's another case in point. He's a children's writer, is an atheist. The God he doesn't believe in is a kind of external God who's detached from nature. But he's rather mystical about nature. He believes there's a spirit, a real life in the natural world to which he's strongly connected. Again, that's an atheism about a particular conception of God, but it goes along with a spiritual sense of connection with nature.
Right, so let's look at that in terms of your scientific work and how you understand what's called the spirituality of nature, which might have to do with resonance and morphic resonance, as you say. And so it's really about consciousness of all of life, of the universe, and science, how science is starting to understand that it's an intelligent universe. And you're one of the great promoters of that.
Well, I think that my own ideas about morphic resonance are mainly to do with the habits of nature. And the habits of nature, like our own habits, are mainly unconscious. I think that nature involves an interplay between habit, and consciousness, and creativity. Habits were originally conscious, and they become unconscious through repetition. I mean, I learned to ride a bicycle when I was a child, and ever since then, I can just get on a bicycle and ride it. I don't have to think about it. But I did have to think about it when I was learning it. I had to learn which pedal to push down and that kind of thing. So I think a lot of our nature is habitual, like the nature of nature itself. And evolution is a kind of interplay of habit and creativity. And creativity comes through consciousness. I see consciousness as concerned with possibilities. And we mainly choose among possibilities. I see spiritual practices as mainly concerned with connecting with the flow of nature and the flow of consciousness that's greater than ourselves. Obviously, the whole universe is greater than ourselves, and life on Earth is greater than ourselves. We're part of a much larger process of flow and development and evolution. And we can easily think of ourselves as separate. and that's isolating and usually depressing. But if we see ourselves as connected with and experience ourselves as connected with this flow of life and of consciousness, that I take to be a spiritual experience, and there are spiritual practices that can help us connect with that experience. One of them is gratitude, because gratitude is very much about recognizing how much we're part of a flow.
Right, and so to me, a lot of what we're trying to do is align ourselves with flow, and perhaps align ourselves with resonant patterns that we've developed or humanity has developed over its history, and also our universal spirit has developed in its history. And so these resonances have different levels of cohesiveness, for instance. And so when we're in these different practices of meditation and sound, singing, chanting, even pilgrimages, visiting holy places, we're attuning to resonances, to frequencies that exist through our actions. For instance, I'm not a great meditator. I've had some extremely profound meditations, and I don't seek them out as much because I really do live, I believe, in a universal consciousness, since I'm practicing intuitive and I speak with the universe all the time. So I feel connected all the time. But I've been a runner all my life. And I remember years ago speaking with some Tibetan lamas, Rinpoches, about meditation and saying to them, you know, I don't do all these practices, these meditative practices, but I'm always running. And they said, oh, that's good. Keep it up. Because that gets you into a state that is in alignment with different energies.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, Peter, because I'm writing a sequel to Science and Spiritual Practices at the moment. And one of the things I'm writing about is sports as a spiritual practice. I think that in the modern world, one of the most common ways in which people experience altered states of consciousness and a sense of being connected with something greater and being in the flow is indeed through sports, of which running is one example. And there's a lot of stuff about the runner's high and about being in the flow. This can also happen through fast sports like downhill skiing. And then there's this whole proliferation and evolution of new sports in the last 50 or 60 years: hang gliding, snowboarding,
right,
windsurfing. All of these are about experience, primarily about experience. They can become competitive, but that's not what they're primarily about. They're about sensations and experiences. And we've now got sort of hundreds of billions of dollars a year spent on sports, so that which people are doing to get experiences, to have experiences. And I think the appeal of that, in many cases, is that it's possible to get into this state of flow, the sense of connection, the sense of being in the present. Meditation is one way of getting out of the discursive mind, what's the default mode network within the brain, which is, about ruminations and worries and fears and so forth. Meditation can help you be in the present. But as one of my friends who's a rock climber said, when he was really busy, when his mind was completely full, he tried meditating, it didn't work. But when he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was completely in the present.
You had to pay attention.
He had to pay attention. He couldn't let his mind wander. And if you're in the middle of a football game and you've got to be totally attentive to what's happening all around you. So I think that that sports are indeed one of the ways in which, in the modern world, in which many people do, without even calling it spiritual, which they do have a kind of spiritual practice.
Yeah, and there are books on that aspect of sports, and I see it as developing sports habits or abilities that bring you into what might be called the sweet spot, where you
Yes.
feel at one with your body and with nature and with movement, and everything around you just flows. It's the flow that you're at one with.
Absolutely. And of course, to do that, you have to have a practice. You have to be skillful enough to get
Right.
into the sweet spot. You can't get into that if you're fumbling or not sure what to do next. You have to have a kind of confidence to flow with it. And I suppose the most articulate statement of this early on in this discussion was through Herrigel's book, Zen and the Art of Archery, where he shows how it was just being in the state of just happening. And Michael Murphy was one of the people who really drew attention to the spiritual dimension of sport. And I think he was influenced by Herrigel and by martial arts, which are all, again, where the spiritual side and the physical side are much more explicitly connected. And Michael Murphy wrote a book, Golf in the Kingdom, about the spiritual side of golf. Yes, so I think part of the practice in the case of sports is simply getting good enough at what you're doing so you can be in the zone, in the flow, which you can't unless you have the action. You have to put in the effort, the practice to get to that state.
So that's very exciting to think of sports activities as a spiritual practice. And so many sports can lead us to that. I'm just picturing bowling and being able to hit those strikes one after another is a
Yes.
spot.
Well, it's a skill. I mean, it's a skill and it's satisfying. And if you're really good at it, again, you have to be completely present. If you're going to bowl well, you can't just be worrying about whether you paid the electricity bill or something like that. You've got to be completely present in what you're doing.
Right. And so what the next question is, where is it all leading in terms of how humankind is progressing at this point?
Well, I think we're on the threshold of a new phase of religious and spiritual evolution. People often juxtapose science and religion. They say science is all about progress, development, discovery, religion and spirituality all about looking back and it's all fixed. But that's not true. The spiritual and religious realms are evolving all the time. I mean, the very fact that meditation has spread all over the West, there's been all this research done on it, there's all sorts of new ways of teaching it, that's an evolutionary step. I would like to think my own book is part of that process because it's helping to bring the scientific and the spiritual approaches together. And religions evolve. I mean, Judaism today is not the same as in 1000 BC, and Christianity today is not the same as it was 100 or 200 years ago. One of the evolutions in the last 100 years in Christianity has been a huge growth of Pentecostalism, of charismatic Christianity, things like speaking in tongues and healing. And something like a quarter of Christians worldwide are now within that movement, and it barely existed before the year 1900. There are evolutionary changes going on all the time. And I think that this bringing together of the different spiritual traditions of the world and the scientific study of them is actually part of this new phase of human evolution, which is a kind of spiritual evolution. And various religious traditions will no doubt evolve as part of that process. I mean, some, of course, will be conservative and may not evolve, just as in every area of life there are conservatives who want to keep things the same. But this evolutionary process is happening whether we like it or not.
Right, and I always think of an underlying principle of evolution or a purpose of evolution. What the universe is seeking to attain is more and more and more refinement. And it doesn't always feel that way. It looks like right now, in the world we're in right now, we're becoming more and more unrefined. But I think that's part of the process of refinement.
Well, I'm an optimist too. I'd certainly like to think that. On the surface, there's many crass and awful things happening.
Right.
But I think what we're seeing really is a breakdown of the old unquestioning belief in material progress. I mean, people used to think we could just go on making more and more products, getting richer and richer all the time. Well, the environmental crisis itself is showing us we've got to change our ways. And the models that have worked for several generations are not working anymore. So obviously we're in a turbulent period. But I don't think we're ever going to go back to a totally unquestioning faith in progress, which is what was the dominant philosophy when I was growing up as a boy. I mean, everyone believed in sort of almost uncritically in progress.
That's a scientific progress.
Yes, scientific, economic, and material. Yes.
Right. And maybe the only answer is really a progress in consciousness.
Well, I think that should go along with the others. We've had an unbalanced development, which has all been about gross national product and greater prosperity and more products, and indeed more waste. What we're going to have to find is some kind of new balance. Otherwise, humanity is not going to survive for very long as a civilization.
Right, and there's a lot that we don't know to be able to do that, and perhaps leading a spiritual practice can put us into a consciousness that's much more able to use wisdom and innovation through intuition, and an inner knowing that can find answers.
That's certainly my hope too.
Right, and that's what your book is really for, is to allow people to really respect a spiritual path and understand that it fits into our natural rhythms that enhance us scientifically.
Exactly. And every chapter in my book of the 7 spiritual practices, I end with 2 very simple practices that anyone can do at home for free. My aim is to show that actually you can take part in all these things. They're not things that monks in distant monasteries do, and they exclude normal people. They're something that anyone can do.
Right. Now it's so helpful, and I think people really should enjoy reading Science and Spiritual Practices, because it's very enlightening about so many different things that we want to know more about. And so your life is being guided to really help so many of us. That's wonderful. And so we all want to feel, as you said, more optimistic about our progress, and maybe we just need to get out of our own way and climb into our own frequencies and resonances that are deeper and more sustaining.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. So for our audience, they can find the book in bookstores and online, and
they can listen to it too, the audible version read by me. So if anyone prefers listening to a book instead of reading it, that's an option as well.
Oh, good. And is there a website?
Yes, my own website, www.sheldrake.org. There's a lot more information about my work. All my scientific papers are on there for free. There's lots of podcasts, interviews, talks, and so on. So there's a huge amount of material, all free of charge, on my website, sheldrake.org.
That's wonderful. This is so exciting to talk with you. So many of our audience, I'm sure, are very familiar with your work and your books, and are going to be happy to read more and know more from from your new book and your website. So I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Energy Stew.
Thanks, Peter. Very good to be with you.
Thank you. And we're going to end the show. This is Peter Roth, your host of Energy Stew at prn.fm. And I can be reached at peter@heartriver, HEART river.org. And we're going to have follow up from this show with a fundraiser for our station, because it really can use your support at prn.fm. And thank you so much for listening.